Welcome to Variations 4, Lytes and pH unit. Question number 31, which is essentially interpreting ABGs. Let me say right up from the outset that this is a very basic overview of interpreting ABGs. We can definitely complicate things here. And in life, you'll see some patients that will fall into a fairly simple interpretation of ABGs, and this will help you. There'll be other patients where it's going to be much more difficult to figure out what's going on, and you'll need more of a context, and maybe even the help of one of the physicians to help you interpret that. So we are going through some very basic, straightforward pH cases here, but this is to help interpret what we do out there when we're on the med-surg wards, and it does help to some extent. So here we go. We're looking at maps 14 and 15, but in actual fact, we're not going to talk about 14 because it really is something you can fill in yourself based on what A, we're about to do, and B, what we've already discussed above in previous videos. So I'll leave that for you. It's mostly all filled in anyways. I'm not going to go through it again because it's highly repetitive of previous videos. We're going to just kind of go over this page here, which already has the answers on it, but I'm going to show you how we got to those answers. So I recommend covering the answers, and I recommend working through these on your own to try and interpret them. That being said, I will go through them now and show you my way of thinking about this. So let's say you have a patient who has these ABG results. Our aim is to try and figure out what is the patient experiencing here? What's happening with the body? Are they in metabolic or respiratory, acidosis or alkalosis? Is it fully compensated or partially compensated? And that's really all we're trying to determine. And that's, interpreting ABGs on a basic level. And then of course you'd have to, after that, go to your patient, look at the context, look at the presentation, and figure out kind of what the game plan is. But we're just keeping it very narrow and very simple and just saying, how do we interpret these ABGs? So let's do the first one. So I encourage you to write down what I'm about to say in terms of interpreting this. First of all, I want to say this. Interpret these line by line. Okay? Now, for us right now, we don't need to look at partial O2. It's a very important value, of course, but in terms of interpreting the ABGs per se, at the level we're doing it at, we don't need to look at O2. So for now, O2 is going to be kind of a silent point here. We're going to be really focusing on pH, CO2, and bicarbonate. So let's look at these line by line, and you have to do this in order to figure this out. It's the easiest way. So if you look at, and the normal values are on the right here, and the findings are on the middle column. So let's go line by line. pH is 7.32. So now I'm going to ask you, what is that? Is that relatively acidic, or is that relatively basic or alkalotic? Basic and alkalotic being the same thing. So acidic or basic? Well, it's on the low side, so it's acidic. So beside pH, write acidic. So right away, right off the top, we know we're talking about some degree of acidosis here. So if you're writing a multiple choice exam, for example, you can cross out any of the ones that have alkalosis in it. We've already ruled those out. This is the beauty of going line by line, because we've looked at the pH and we've said, well, it's on the low side. It's below normal range, and that puts it in the acidic range. So we know we're talking about some kind of acidosis. Okay, next line. The PCO2 is 52. So what would you say about that? Is that a result, CO2, that is relatively basic or relatively acidic? Well, it's high. So you would say that it is acidic. It's high, and CO2 dissociates into hydrogen, which is acidic. And so we'd say the CO2 here is an acidic player, if you don't mind using that term. So write acidic beside CO2. What's going on with bicarbonate now? It's 35. That's high. Same question comes out to you, acidic or basic? Well, we know bicarb is a basic player. So if it's high, then it's having a relatively basic effect on the body. So write basic beside the bicarb. So without even reading the answer, I can tell you that what we're looking at here, we match them up. The pH was acidic, the CO2 was acidic, and we're talking about acidosis. So match them up. The CO2 is a respiratory issue, isn't it? If we're breathing too rapidly, we get rid of CO2, or if we're breathing too slowly or respiratory drive is depressed, we hold on to CO2 and it builds up. So the pH is acidic, the CO2 is acidic, CO2 is a respiratory deal. So we're looking at respiratory acidosis, and it looks like the bicarb is trying to compensate, trying to buffer us back into a more homeostatic state. So we call this respiratory acidosis with partial renal compensation, because bicarb's a renal product. What's this partial compensation bit? If the body is able to push pH back into a normal range, we'd say the body is fully compensated. That doesn't mean the problem is solved, but it means for the time being, pH is holding its own in a normal range. In this case, and in pretty much well, most of the abnormal cases you're going to see, the pH is not within normal range. Normal range is 7.35 to 7.45. So best we can say is that the body is partially compensating because it hasn't pushed it back to normal range. It's kind of like this. Let's say someone has, let's use something you know really well. Let's use blood pressure just to cover the points of partial compensation and full compensation, total compensation. Let's say someone's hypovolemic. Their blood pressure is, let's just say, 95/70, and their heart rate's 120. What would you say there? You know the heart rate's compensating, helping to increase pressure in the vessels, but are they fully compensated or partially compensated? Before I answer that, compare that with a patient who's got a heart rate of 130. Hypovolemic, heart rate of 130, and their blood pressure is 120/80, golden, normal, beautiful. I'm still worried about both patients. They both have hypovolemia, and both of their hearts are working hard to compensate. I'm worried about them both. The difference between them is the first one, whose blood pressure was 95/70, is partially compensated because we haven't been able to push that blood pressure up to a normal range. The second one is compensated because they're in a normal range. Both may be still in deep trouble. We have to figure out why the heart has to work so hard to compensate. But the only point we're trying to highlight here is the difference between partial compensation and compensation. I will let you read this paragraph on your own. We've kind of gone over the gist of things. You can read the paragraph on your own. Next question. We're going to just go through here and figure out our pH deal. Okay, the next one. pH is 7.48. That's a bit high. What is that, acidic or basic? It's basic or alkalotic. CO2, 31. Is that high or low? It's low. Is that acidic or basic, relatively speaking? Well, if CO2 is low, that pushes the body relatively towards a more basic environment, if you know what I mean, because it's less hydrogen in the blood. So it's pushing pH towards something more alkalotic or basic. It's low. But bicarb is low too. Now, there could be lots of reasons for that. It could be kidney failure. Could be that you're running out of bicarb stores. Whatever the case, the cause of the low bicarb is not really the issue. The issue that we're looking at now in this calculation is that level of bicarb 18, a low bicarb, is that driving the body more towards acidity or more towards alkalosis? Well, bicarb is basic in its nature. So if the body's level of bicarb is lower than what it naturally has, 21 to 28, it's pushing the body towards something more acidic. So what we could say, what we have here is we match the pH and the CO2 up. They're both basic. Maybe the patient's hyperventilating, blowing off excess CO2. Whatever the case, we're looking at respiratory alkalosis. And probably what's going on is their kidneys are dumping bicarb to try and bring the body to a more middle homeostatic ground by pushing us towards the acidic side of things to bring us back to homeostasis. And so indeed, we've got respiratory alkalosis with partial renal compensation, partial because, hey, we're not back in our normal range yet. All right, third one, 7.30. That's low. Is that basic or acidic? That's acidic. CO2, 28, that's low. What does that drive us towards? A more acidity or a more alkaline? Well, CO2 is low, it's pushing us towards a more basic, less hydrogen in the blood. Bicarb is low. All things being equal, bicarb is a basic element, isn't it? So it's a basic player. So if it's low in the body, too low in the body, it's driving us towards acidity in and of itself. So we match them up. In this case, the bicarb and the pH are both the acidic ones, and the CO2 is the basic one. So what you've got here is, for whatever reason, again, it could be kidney failure, dumping bicarb and it's not supposed to, who knows? But the point is it's low, pushing us towards acidosis. So we've got metabolic acidosis with partial respiratory compensation. So your person here might be hyperventilating and blowing off excess CO2. So metabolic acidosis with partial respiratory compensation. Okay, last one here. 7.48, what are we looking at here? Well, that's a bit high, so that is basic. CO2, 47, that's a bit high. CO2, that makes it acidic. And the bicarb is 36, that's a bit high. That's pushing us towards a more alkaline or basic way. Match them up and you get metabolic alkalosis with partial respiratory compensation. Here you might see the guy hypoventilating, holding in CO2. So metabolic alkalosis with partial respiratory compensation.